Another approach to cognitive development, if you guys recall, was the information processing theory. And this is the theory where we said that it likened the human mind or the brain to a computer. And it was built on the fact that basically, just like a computer, that we input information in it. Um, and then the software does the part of analyzing, and then it produces a conclusion or a printout or a result. The brain does the same thing. We input information into our brain through our senses. We pick up that from stimuli around us, and then it goes to the brain to be analyzed, and then we give a product, and the product comes in the form of an action or a reaction. So, by tracing those paths of these functions in the brain, scientists started to understand the learning process. What happens in the brain when we input information in it? And what they came up with is the fact that the brain is affected by repeated connections between one stimulus and another. And that basically the brain connections and pathways are built from repeated experiences. So the more we frequent a particular path, from beginning of input to the end result or the output, the faster we're able to master or achieve that task. One particular leader in the information processing perspective is Robert Siegler. And what he did was actually study the day by day details of children's cognition in math in particular. And he looked at how children improve in their ability or mathematical skills in relationship to the number line, for example, memorizing simple facts about numbers, and how that they utilize certain strategies or ways to master that skill. So if you were to ask a child, for example, what is 5 plus 5, chances are they will give you the answer much faster than if you were to ask them what is 9 plus 7. So they might resort to some sort of a skill or a way that they connected that in their mind. They might count on their fingers, or might use their use the bigger number and then add the smaller number later in their head, in order to give that answer. So that process of from input to output is something that proved the importance of repetition when it comes to experiences that children are exposed to during their school age years. Memory is also one of those areas that scientists rely on the information processing approach to understand. And when they look at memory, they see that from the start of input to output, which is when we do a retrieval to a particular memory that we've inputted, we really follow a pathway that is similar to the information processing approach. So we start out with sensory memory, into the working memory, and finally we end with a long-term memory. So let's look at those and the definitions of those three. Sensory memory is defined as the incoming stimulus information that we pick up from our environment. And usually it is stored for a split second in the brain before it is moved to the next stage, which is called the working memory. The working memory, which used to be called short-term memory, is basically where all the work is going to happen. This is where the conscientious thought process and mental activity is going to take place. Us being able to connect it to something, code it, and make it more easily remembered in some sort of a way. And then we send it to what we call the long-term memory. The long-term memory is basically your storage unit. This is where you're going to store that memory for different durations based on how well you coded it during the working memory stage. So it could either stay there for a minute or an hour or a year or multiple years. The capacity, of course, is huge by the end of middle childhood, and that's why the bulk of our memorization, I want to say, the things that we really learn, the majority of our learning takes place during the elementary school years. There's a lot of learning that takes place. There's a lot of storage that happens during that stage. Now, what's important is not just to put things in that storage bin, but actually be able to retrieve it. So the next important process is the concept of retrieval, and that is how easily for us to remember or pull back those items that we placed in that storage unit. Of course, long-term memory is not perfect. We all forget, but again, it's with repetition and revisiting that path that we kind of solidify that information that we put. Meaningfulness is a key term to the processing of information and the retrieval. So this small diagram shows the process of input, and this is something that we pick up through our senses, whether it is something that you heard, you smelled, you touched, or you tasted. So it goes, you pick it up and then you send it to an area in your brain which is called the sensory memory area, which will hold it for a split second. You can see everything around you if you're able to see. You can hear everything around you, but it's only what you pay attention to that kind of moves into another stage or another area. So if in the span of, let's say, 5 minutes, I might be talking and somebody might be talking behind you, and another person, the phone rings, and your family's speaking next in the next room. Everything is happening at the same time. You need that selective attention in order to pull it into the next stage, which is where the working is going to happen. This is the short-term memory area, or the working memory area. And this is when I'm going to start to kind of make sense of that information and encode it, and be able to kind of use some sort of skills to keep it in place so that I can move it into the last stage, which is the long-term memory. Now, when there is a need for me to bring it back or say something, I'm going to check back in from my short-term memory into my long-term memory and retrieve that information. And short-term memory is where the output comes from. This is where you would ask me, what did you cook yesterday? And I would have to go to my long-term memory to remember what I cooked yesterday, and then bring it to my short-term memory or my working memory and tell you, oh, I cooked chicken yesterday. Now, information processing theory emphasizes that there are multiple control processes that regulate that flow of information. So in order for this process to happen smoothly, we have to have certain control processes. And the two important control processes that we talked about previously is emotional regulation and selective attention. So if I was trying to get you to remember something, it will be really hard if I was doing it while you were extremely nervous or angry or stressed. So stress kind of affects our attention and our memory and our ability to study, let's say. So if you are studying for a test and you are under a lot of stress, chances are you are not going to be able to remember all the information and move it to long-term memory. Similarly, if you were surrounded by a lot of distractors and you were not able to selectively attend to the information so you can start to code it or encode it so that it's sent to the long-term memory, you would not be able to successfully keep it there and retrieve it when you need to. So these two particular control processes are very important: emotional regulation and selective attention. But perhaps the ultimate control process is what is called metacognition. And that is really thinking about thinking, or having the awareness to control your own cognitive process. So when you are looking at, in a way, it's kind of like having a brain that's looking at your brain. This is metacognition, really looking at what best ways do I process information by. Looking at your study habits, looking at your mood, looking at what really gets you to think and focus best. If you have that mental ability to reflect from within on yourself or on your thought process, this is the ultimate control process, is being able to evaluate, for example, a cognitive task to determine how to accomplish it. So I have a test. What is the best way that I can accomplish that goal? I know myself, so I need to reflect from within that, okay, I need to sit in a quiet place, maybe I have no one interrupt me, and write down the words as I am studying them, and when I'm done, read them out loud to myself, and then have someone test me in them. So now I have examined how do I best accomplish my goal, utilizing my insight into my cognitive abilities, and how do I best function in what situation and in what circumstances. Of course, the more I learn about a particular subject, the easier it becomes. So if I were to introduce to you, for example, anything about Piaget now, you have enough knowledge base about cognitive development that you are building on the steps that we talked about, or the stages that Piaget proposed. So you're able to understand better. So knowledge base is basically a body of knowledge in a particular area that makes it easier to remember and understand new information in that area. So if I did not start you off learning about, let's say, sensory motor development and how a baby starts to understand or cognate their environment, and then took you up to the early years and how children construct their knowledge, and then took you to the middle childhood, I moved you slowly. So now when you are learning about middle childhood cognitive development, it's easier for you to connect information and build on that previous knowledge. So knowledge base is the body of knowledge that makes it easier for you to learn new knowledge. What influences knowledge base is past experience, as we said, and of course, current opportunity. What I'm doing right now is giving you the opportunity to build on that previous experience. I'm explaining it in a different way so that I can make the connection for you. And of course, on top of all of this is personal motivation. If there was no motivation from you yourself learning about this subject or this topic, you wouldn't be able to retain any of the information that I am providing you. It's that personal motivation in the topic that makes the information easier for you to remember or retain or memorize.